So in this video, I'm going to answer the question, why does God allow bad things to happen in life? Now, let me make that question personal. Why does God allow bad things to happen to me? Why does God allow bad things to happen to you, to people that we love? You know, I asked that question twice in my life. The first time was when my 14-year-old brother died, and my mom just went to a very deep, deep grief. And seeing her in that state just broke my heart. And the second time was when I was working for the United Nations, and I was assigned in areas where the poorest of the poor lived. So for my entire working life with that international development agency, I was surrounded by extreme poverty. I saw people die of starvation, especially children. I saw families unable to provide for their most basic needs, for food, for shelter, for safe drinking water, for education, for livelihood. They practically had nothing. And so oftentimes during those times, I would cry out to God, and I would ask him, why? Why do you allow this to happen? Now, fortunately for me, when I was in my 30s, God blessed me with a spiritual mentor, an Italian priest who patiently taught me the Bible for 10 years. And I asked him this question, and I can never forget the first 3 words which he said in response to my question. He said, I don't know. He said, I don't know. Well, what he actually meant was we can never really fully understand why God allows bad things to happen in our lives and in the world. Why? Because we cannot really stand on God's shoes. We don't have his mind. We don't see things the way he does. He is God. We're not. My mentor, I remember, told me a story in the life of Saint Catherine of Siena, which can be found in the book written by Blessed Raymond of Capua, who was her confessor. So when Jesus first appeared to Saint Catherine, he said, do you know, daughter, who you are and who I am? And then he said, if you know these 2 things, then you will be blessed. You are she who is not, whereas I am he who is. Have this knowledge in you, and the enemy will never deceive you. So our Lord simply told Saint Catherine that, look, he said, I am God, you're not. Now the problem is, we tend to forget the last part, the part which says you're not. So we naturally think that when bad things happen, we think that God shouldn't have let those things happen, because if we were God, we certainly wouldn't have allowed them. We would have done things differently. But here's the thing. He is God. We're not. And so because he is God and we're not, we cannot really understand fully why God allows bad things to happen in our lives and in the world. But we can understand some things. So I just want to point out 3 things which I'm hoping will be helpful when you feel inclined to ask the question, why? Now, the first thing that I want to point out is God does not create evil and suffering. So God does not create the injuries, the illnesses, crime, abuse, and other bad stuff that happens in our lives. Now, maybe you will ask, well, if he doesn't create it, where does it come from? The answer lies in what can be both a blessing and a curse, and that is our ability to choose. God gave us free will, the freedom to decide how we will act, and the ability to make moral choices. In fact, this is what distinguishes us from animals, but it can also be the greatest source of pain and suffering. While we are capable of doing good, we are also very capable of making selfish, self-centered, and even evil choices. And when this happens, it's not just us who get hurt, but others. Now, God can simply eliminate all the pain and suffering and other negative stuff in your life, in mine, and in the whole world. He can. But he has to remove our freedom to choose. He could have made us like robots, where he can just tell us to do certain things by pushing a button or by simply saying specific commands. But he doesn't want us to be robots. He wants us to love and to be loved freely. He wants us to love him and each other freely. But sadly, in a world of free choices, doing God's will is seldom done. Doing our will is much more common and easier, isn't it? Now, the second thing also that I want to point out is while God allows certain bad things to happen in life, he can also turn our crucifixions to resurrections. He can turn our Good Fridays to Easters. So he can take all the pain and suffering that we're going through and cause something good to come out of them if we love and follow him. As St. Paul said in his letter to the Romans, chapter 8, verse 28, and I quote, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with this verse, "For we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, who are called according to his purpose." So, if we choose to follow him, to trust him, to love him, he can turn all our pain and suffering into something, into a blessing. He can make our pain and suffering so that we can become better versions of ourselves, so that we can be closer to him, or even influence other people's lives in a positive way. That's why it's so important to have a long-term perspective when it comes to life and when it comes to pain and suffering. You know, if you are feeling disappointed, feeling frustrated, feeling hopeless, if you are undergoing a bad experience, it's probably because you are looking at it from a short-term perspective. But if you would look at it from a long-term perspective and seeing through the eyes of faith, then you will find out later on that all the pain, all the suffering, out of those pain and suffering that you have undergone, came out incredible blessings. So that's why I always encourage people to think long term. Think 5 years, 10 years, even 20 years down the road, and keep your faith, because in the long run, when you reflect on all the bad experiences you have gone through, and then you connect the dots, and then you see where God has taken you, you will realize that you are in a much, much better place. Okay, the third thing that I want to point out, and the last thing, is actually related to the second point that I just made. But let me tell you a story just to illustrate my point. I got this story actually in the web from a British pastor named Gavin Reed. So he was telling a story about a 17-year-old boy who fell down a long flight of stairs when he was a baby, and he broke his back. So he was in constant pain because of this broken back. He was in and out of the hospital. So, but then here's the thing. He made a comment. That young man made a comment. He said, God is fair. So Gavin Reed asked him, so how long have you been in and out of the hospital? And he said, 13 years. Remember, he was only 17. And for 13 years, he was in and out of the hospital in constant pain. And then, but he said, God is fair. And so Gavin Reed said, and you think God is fair? And you know what the young man said? He said, well, God has all eternity to make it up to me. You know, one of my favorite songs in the Catholic Book of Worship, our hymn book at church, starts with the words, eye has not seen, ear has not heard what God has made ready for those who love him. And it is actually what the boy was saying. He was saying that our pain and suffering pale in comparison they pale in comparison with what God has in store for us if we love him and if we follow him. They all pale in comparison.